Друзі, вітаємо вас. Вас вітає мережа захисту національних інтересів АНС і наша школа доброго врядування. Я хочу представити нашу лідерку Ганну Гопко, яка є тут з нами. І хочу надати їй слово для вступного вітального слова, а потім ми повернемося до наших таких організаційних моментів, і я розкажу, що буде далі. Вітаю, Ганна, тобі слово.
Вітаю, Олено, вітаю всіх учасників нашої школи доброго врядування. Ось, я тільки повернулася з Індії, з столиці Делі, де відбувається підготовка до саміту G20. І оскільки ми починаємо наш курс із геополітики, ось Україні, зважаючи на те, що наша мережа національних інтересів захищає наші національні інтереси в світі, наближує перемогу, нам теж треба розуміти, які наші геополітичні інтереси. На жаль, Україну не запрошено на саміт G20, як відповів на наше питання міністр закордонних справ Індії, тому що G20 – це про економічний ріст. Ось, хоча російська агресія проти України вона призвела до проблем, які стосуються із забезпеченням світу продовольством. Ось Україна одна з найпотужніших аграрних держав. Вона забезпечила до проблем із енергоносіями, також питання добрив. І в Індії всі прекрасно розуміють, наскільки важливо є завершення війни, яку не називають агресією Росії, кажуть конфлікт в Україні. Тому для міжнародної дипломатії дуже важливо теж розуміти, які інтереси великих гравців. Ось, Індія цікава, тому що зараз це найбільша в світі держава за населенням, 1 мільярд 430 мільйонів, уявіть собі. Ну і після того, як в них відбулася висадка на місяць, їхні амбіції зросли до того, щоб із 6-ї стати 3-ю економікою в світі. І багато я ще буду вам розповідати на окремій лекції про геополітику і як Україна працює на міжнародній арені, де в нас є ключові пріоритети – це вступ України до НАТО і Європейського Союзу, це закріплені в Конституції пріоритети, але є і такі завдання, як працювати взагалі із світом, глобальним півднем, де крім Індії, Китай, Бразилія, тобто це країни Латинської Америки, Африки, Азії. І я думаю, що для вас, представників різних громад, міст України, різних університетів з різним досвідом, важливо мати ці знання, розуміння, що керує світом, які питання від глобалізації до дисбалансу різних гравців, питання діджиталізації, бік-дейта, штучного інтелекту, робототехніки, наноелектроніки, мікрочіпів. Наша мережа АНС працює також із урядом Тайваню, і від гуманітарної допомоги в перспективі ми хочемо перейти на співпрацю в секторі безпеки, обороноздатності і новітніх технологій. Тому для вас дуже важливо буде на цьому курсі ставити питання професорам, челенджити їх, ну, як то кажуть, провокувати. 10-й рік російської агресії проти України. Ось за 10 років Україна, яка здала 3-й в світі ядерний потенціал і натомість не отримала справжніх безпекових гарантій. Ось, зокрема, чому я про це говорю? Тому що Індія, країна, яка ще за часів Індіри Ганді в 1974 році створила свою ядерну зброю, і в питаннях російського ядерного шантажу в них є принципи, що ядерна держава не може шантажувати неядерну, і тому в дипломатії, зокрема, були жорсткі розмови, як нам сказали в МЗС в Делі, буквально 2 дні тому, що вони розмовляли з Російською Федерацією, щоб вони перестали шантажувати нас і підривом Запорізької атомної станції, і питання, які стосуються Чорноморської зернової угоди, тому що від експорту українського продовольства, особливо зерна, залежать мільйони життів, чи не будуть вони страждати від голоду. Це технологія, яку Російська Федерація випробувала століття тому, створивши голодомор-геноцид. Тому, друзі, я всім, хто сьогодні долучився і хто буде учасниками всіх наступних лекцій, в нас є кілька блоків. Особлива подяка Олені Сас, яка в нас також веде європейські студії, детальніше ще розкаже і про школу «Україна на шляху до ЄС», тому що одна з завдань АНС це адвокація після статусу кандидата, відкриття перемовин і підготовка переговірників, які зможуть потужно відстоювати наші інтереси від різних сфер. От я з Індії повернулася зараз в Варшаві по дорозі в Київ. Ви знаєте, яка непроста в нас ситуація між нашими фермерами і польськими. І тому, друзі, чим більше знань у вас буде, розуміння геополітики, розуміння економічних питань, безпекових, як все взаємопов'язано, тим краще ми будемо готові до глобальних викликів, і тим швидше ми наблизимо перемогу і зможемо захищати наші інтереси. Тож дякую Олені, дякую всій команді АНС, які готували, Світлана Єднак за кадром, і всі, хто працює для того, щоб ми могли підготувати круту еліту, ось яка зможе гідно і представляти Україну на міжнародній арені, і відбудовувати всередині, і робити так, щоб у нас була соціально, суспільно, з верховенством права країна. Дякую, Олен.
Дуже дякую, Ганно. І ще раз хочу наголосити на тому, що хто не знає, хто така Ганна Гопко, я думаю, що таких людей мало, але це наша видатна сучасниця, громадська діячка, депутат Верховної Ради 8-го скликання. Вона була головою комітету з міжнародних відносин Верховної Ради. Вона є невтомна дипломатка, борчиня за інтереси України. Я думаю, що її приклад надихає. Хто ще не сильно знає, я прошу вас прогуглити і почитати про Ганну в Вікіпедії, але не тільки. Я хотіла би розказати, що таке, на нашу думку, за нашим задумом, Школа Доброго Врядування АНС, а також розкажу про європейські студії АНС і про наш курс «Україна на шляху до ЄС». У нас є кілька хвилин до приєднання нашого професора, пана Мітчела Оренштайна, професора Пенсільванського університету, з східноєвропейських досліджень та досліджень по Росії. Тож, Школа Доброго Врядування – це наш проєкт нашої організації, мережа захисту національних інтересів АНС. Головна мета – підготувати покоління, таку прошарок людей, еліти української, яка буде в змозі впоратися з тими викликами, які стоять перед нашою державою на цьому історичному етапі. Ми розуміємо, що ми живемо в історичні часи. Може, з одного боку, здатися, що нам не пощастило, а з іншого боку, я хочу сказати, що це величезний виклик для нашого покоління, для вашого покоління, і тому ми маємо бути до цього готові. Тому ми докладаємо в нашій організації зусиль з підготовки молодих людей, які розуміють глобальний контекст, які розуміють виклики, що стоять перед нашою державою, які будуть готові з євроатлантичної інтеграції. І саме тому у нас ідуть два таких просвітницьких проєкти паралельно. Перший проєкт – це Школа Доброго Врядування, на якій ви, власне, вже присутні на першій лекції. А також у нас є на освітній платформі Прометеус безкоштовний курс, який називається «Україна на шляху до ЄС». Він реалізується в рамках нашого євроінтеграційного проєкту «Євроскоп», підтримується Посольством Королівства Нідерланди в Україні програмою «Матра». Ви можете прогуглити також, знайдіть, будь ласка, «Україна на шляху до ЄС» на Прометеусі. Це класна програма, там 7 модулів, які викладають видатні сучасники, в тому числі депутати Європейського парламенту, колишній прем'єр-міністр Литви, колишня міністр оборони Литви, Дмитро Шимків і так далі. Тобто ми запросили найкращих людей, яких тільки змогли запросити, для того, щоб вони виклали своє бачення тих викликів і тих завдань, які стоять перед нами. Будь ласка, якщо ви пройдете цей курс, надішлете нам, мені особисто, сертифікати, ви будете в процесі кастингу поїздки до Брюсселю, і ми будемо далі працювати з такими людьми для того, щоб вони знайшли своє місце в євроінтеграційному процесі, в командах переговорників, в різних структурах українських, владних, в тому числі. Тому Школа Доброго Врядування має на меті сформувати такий прошарок людей, які підуть в місцеве самоврядування і в політику, в тому числі. Тому ви в правильному місці опинилися. Дуже вас з цим вітаю. Ми вас так просто не відпустимо. Це матиме наслідки. Я прошу не втрачати з нами зв'язок. Там є телеграм-чат, до якого ви можете доєднатися. Вам надіслали посилання на нього. Будемо дружити. Значить, далі я вам розкажу технічно, що буде відбуватися. У нас буде зараз лекція, вона буде перекладатися українською мовою. Але в Zoom є опція, якою мовою ви обираєте слухати. Якщо ви володієте англійською мовою в достатній мірі для того, щоб розуміти, що говоритиме Мітчелл Оренштайн, то, будь ласка, слухайте в оригіналі англійською мовою. Якщо ви відчуваєте, що вам потрібен переклад, така опція є, можете слухати українською мовою. Там є, бачите, внизу така панелька Interpretation і планета намальована. Ось, клікаючи на цю на цей значок, ви можете обрати, якою мовою можете слухати лекції. Сама лекція триватиме не більше, ніж 1,5 години. Ми попросимо нашого лектора залишити час на питання та відповіді. Ви могли підготувати заздалегідь питання по темі. Тема – це економічний розвиток України в 90-ті роки і поза ним. Economic Development of Ukraine and Beyond. Ви можете заздалегідь підготувати питання, а також собі занотовувати по ходу лекції ті моменти, які вас зацікавили, і можете ставити питання. Якщо ви захочете поставити питання, то ми просимо вас також, якщо ви не хочете з голосу оголосити питання, можете писати питання в чат. Ось, якщо можна, англійською мовою, якщо ні, то ні, ми перекладемо, але можете так і так ставити питання. Щодо запису, наша зустріч записується, але не транслюється онлайн, тому що є певний відбір. Окей. We have our lecturer with us, Mr. Ornstein.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, nice to meet you. Yes, we are very happy that you are with us online, and welcome to Good Governance School of Arts.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, thank you so much that you agreed to join our Good Governance School and to have a lecture. We have a very big interest and many people are here. We have about 48 participants here, and the lecture will be recorded, and probably we can then share the record of the lecture. So we can start actually. It will be like online translation here. People can choose Ukrainian or English variant of the lecture. So we can start probably.
Okay, wonderful. So I can share my screen, yes? Will I be able to do that? Share my screen?
Yeah, sure,
and,
sure.
Share a presentation? Okay, wonderful. So let me try and do that first. Okay, I think you need to enable the screen sharing.
One moment. We will ask our technical support to do that. Please let Mr. Ornstein to share his screen. Who is in charge, please? It's possible already. Please try to share your screen.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. Hold on a second. Great. Okay, did that work?
Yeah, it works.
Okay, excellent, excellent.
Yeah,
I'm going to go from the beginning. All right. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, so thanks so much. My name's Mítčel Orenштайн. I'm a professor of Russian and East European Studies at University of Pennsylvania. My focus, however, is on Central and Eastern Europe. And this talk is about, I was asked to talk about the issues regarding reconstruction or post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, given some lessons on economic reform in the 1990s. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically, and also ask for your input about, obviously, Ukraine is immersed in a terrible war. Reconstruction, however, is around the corner. The government of Ukraine has actually indicated that it wishes to begin the process of reconstruction before the war is over. And there have been a number of plans published that I was reviewing in this last week by the European Union, by the RAND Corporation, which is a defense contractor in the United States, and also by the Ukrainian government and several other think tanks and entities. And one of the key issues, I think, is avoiding some of the economic reform problems of the 1990s. So the first thing I actually thought that I would like to discuss with you is what exactly you think those, what are those problems, right? And I'm going to see if I can get into the chat here. But when I say, problems of 1990s reforms, what are you thinking about, actually? So I'd like to ask people who are here, students, people present, to just share in the chat some of your thoughts about, okay, what am I talking about here? What are the problems that you might see that you might want to see corrected or not continued, from 1990s economic reforms? Are people able to write in the chat?
Yeah, sure, they're able to write in the chat, but probably they can also answer by voice.
Okay, or we can do it by voice. Yeah. So either way.
People say that it's corruption, judgment system, and so on.
Yeah, corruption, justice system. Lack of massive privatization, interesting. No common idea for Ukraine's future. Yeah, I mean, those are all good ideas. I think, let me see, here's some more. Corruption is the key theme. Problem mentality, perception of new. Lack of ideological integrity, unity, paternalism of society, lack of development of small and medium-sized businesses, pension system. Yeah, that's interesting for me to see. I mean, I think, I'm going to go back to the political instability is another. One language, common ideology, crime. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess that you can see from this list, and I'm going to switch back to the presentation at this point, but you can see from this list that there's a wide variety of issues that people perceive that in this room, in this group, people perceive with the 1990s. And for my part, I've written a book fairly recently called Taking Stock of Shock, together with my colleague Kristen Godsey. And in this book, we essentially try to give an interdisciplinary analysis of what the social consequences were of the 1989 revolutions. We actually stay away from sort of from giving a clear direction why these things happen, because there's a lot of disputes about that. But we just wanted to lay out what were the consequences from a number of different disciplinary standpoints. So we look at this in terms of economic developments, in terms of demographic developments in dozens of countries, and pretty much we're trying to cover the entire former communist European world, and but also in terms of the anthropological literatures on reform, public opinion literatures, people's answers to questions about life conditions, etc. So this was a pretty comprehensive taking stock of what happened as a result of these economic reforms. And so I'm going to talk a little bit from to give you a sort of summary of some of the conclusions that we reach, and then move on to talking about what I think are some of the issues regarding Reconstruction. So I think the primary thing, if we were to draw one lesson from the book, is that economic reforms had widely disparate results in all the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and particularly Ukraine. And I'll talk about in general and also about Ukraine. To some extent, you could see these results on the national level. So if you look at Poland versus Ukraine, you can see Poland obviously had much better economic results than Ukraine did. You could make any number of comparisons. And we compare the countries on a number of different variables, which I'll discuss in a minute. But you could also look at these, you don't have to look at it as a national level. It's actually really interesting to look at it on an individual level, and to look at how different individuals may have fared during the economic reforms. And I think you'd know that that just as some countries did well and poorly, a lot of individuals did well and poorly too. Some countries experienced really high economic growth. Some countries experienced the worst recession in modern history, and I want to underline that it's not well known, I think, although the data of the IMF and the World Bank indicate this, all the general data, that the post-communist recessions were not only very bad recessions, but they were literally the worst set of economic recessions to ever hit any group of modern societies since economic data has been recorded starting in the 1800s. Okay, so I just want to stop on that. In particular, what Ukraine experienced was not just a bad recession. It was one of the worst economic events that occurred in modern history, and dwarfs, at least according to the economic data, dwarfs the Great Depression of the 1930s by many times. And I'll show you some data on that in a second. I also want to just stop there to point out that may be surprising to some people. I know that, for instance, when I have presented this talk to groups in Ukraine before, some people say, no, actually everything went really well after 1991, and economically we've been doing really great. I don't know what you're talking about. And that's exactly the point that I want to make, is that what's weird about the transition, what's unusual about the transition, is that some people experienced really, really significant economic growth and positive development starting in 1990s, while other people experienced the worst economic recession in modern history. So it's very unlike any other economic event that I can think of. For instance, one could compare it to the Great Depression, but in the Great Depression, that at least in the United States and Germany, the countries I know more about, that affected everybody. The Great Depression, there were very few people who were positively affected by the Great Depression, right? But the transition, which was even worse economically, actually had a positive effect on quite a number of people and a negative effect on others. And so you end up with analyses of the 1990s that differ between people who say, oh, there was a slight recession and then everything went up, this kind of J-curve notion. And then other people who say that this was an absolute disaster and it cut 20 years out of the economic development of our country, which is more of a disaster capitalism narrative. And the point of our book was to actually tell which of these narratives was true. We thought, okay, there's no way that both of these narratives are true. So we're going to gather all the data we can, and we're going to prove either there was a short recession and now great economic growth, or there was a terrible long recession. And the surprising reality and the surprising result of our book is that actually both are true. It just depends who you're looking at, which individuals you look at, and which countries you look at. Both of these things happen. And that's the thing that is very hard for people, I think, to understand about the transition. We also look, as I mentioned, at demographic impacts. So some people question the economic data. Many top economists, and I've discussed this project with Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, and with Kalman Mijay, and I don't know, many top economists, Anders Osland, who came to the conference for the book that we presented, and they question, interestingly, the top economists tend to question the official economic data. And they say, well, yeah, the economic data shows that, but the economic data is flawed. The economic data wasn't able to really account for the level of production in 1989 under communism. And so we don't really know how far the economy fell. They tend to sort of minimize that. I tried to find evidence that of any type that it was minimized, and the answer is that there is no evidence, actually. And in fact, one of the ways we sought to triangulate this was to say, well, if the recession wasn't as bad as people thought, we should be able to see demographic impacts not being that bad, right? For instance, life expectancy didn't fall, mortality didn't rise. Other sort of indicators that are non-economic indicators would show that actually there wasn't a recession. But in fact, what we find is that for the worst impacted countries anyway, and I'll show you the data, that there were very, very severe demographic impacts, which I think you're aware of birth declines, death increases, population declines, outmigration, et cetera. And all that, I think, we used to triangulate with the economic data and show that there was a very, very significant economic event that occurred at that time. And of course, you saw the rise of oligarchs and poverty. I think that says it all, right? That the 1990s are known for oligarchs and for poverty, right? And that, I think, so we all see that in front of us, but not so many people have processed that what that meant was that there was a vast process of inequality occurring in the 1990s. As a result of a lot of these trends, trust in government declined pretty substantially. And just to reiterate that, a lot of theorists of transition, a lot of the ways that people talk about transition either predict a sort of J-curve or a disaster capitalism approach. Both of these are actually, unfortunately, fairly accurate pictures of what happened in transition. So if there's one chart, so I want to go to the data. This project is very, very heavily based on data, and I'm going to scratch the surface today just to show you a few data points. But if there's one chart that summarizes what we are arguing in the book, I think it's this one. And this is a chart of, we start the economic recession in year zero. So for, it's the year zero is the first year of economic reform. So for East European countries, that would be, for Central European countries like Poland, that would be 1989 or 1990. And for Ukraine, I think it would be 91. And then we chart this against the blue line is the Great Depression in the United States. And that year zero is 1929 for that recession. And we show the, just look at the blue line for a second. This is the Great Depression. In the United States, the economy went into recession for 4 years. From 1929 to 1933 was the deepest year of the Depression. There was a huge drop in GDP per capita. So this is charting GDP per capita, that's per person. domestic product, and it declined by approximately 30% in the US, which is a very substantial drop. And continued dropping, although at a slower rate, up until year 8 or then year 10, and only after about like 8 or 10 years did the economy really start growing again. So it was kind of like a lost decade. Interestingly, what you see from that is that then we divide the post-communist, the former communist countries into 3 groups. The green group being the best performers. So this is an average of the top performers. That would include Poland and Czech Republic and Slovenia. And we chart their recession. And you see that the trajectory of their recession is similar to the Great Depression. It's actually not quite as bad. The big drop occurs after 3 years. Whoops, I skipped ahead. The big drop occurs after 3 years, and then it follows a somewhat more positive trajectory also of growth afterwards. But it's fairly comparable, I think you'd see, to the Great Depression of the United States in the 1930s. The red group, and this includes Ukraine, is the group of countries that had the worst economic performance over time. And here, interestingly, at the time we wrote, and I think our data set ended in 2016, we published a book in 2019, I believe, or 2021. No, maybe it goes to 2018, and we finished in 2021. By that time, the average of the bottom 10 transition countries in Ukraine had not gotten back to 1989 levels of GDP per capita. Okay, so this was a 20 plus, for some countries, 20 plus year recession in which the change in GDP per capita was actually 60%, not 30%. Of course, averages hide a lot. You know, we'll see something in the next slide, but overall, you can see that this recession, if you look at I think the area of loss, of economic loss, is everything below the 0 line, the status quo line. The area below the line is something like 6 to 10 times larger than during the Great Depression in the United States. That's what I mean by the largest economic drop in world history, the biggest recession ever. And if you look at just the median countries, those are everybody. I think there's a top 10, a bottom 10, and then all the others that are in the middle averaged out. The average post-communist country didn't really come back to 1989 or 91 levels of production until 17 years later. Okay. Any questions? Maybe I'm just going to stop for a couple questions about this. Do you have any questions about that, the chart? And this is just purely World Bank economic data. We're not making up any of these things or coming up. I think we, in some cases, if it's not complete in the early 1980s, we're also supplementing from US government sources. But by and large, this is just straight out of IMF. And what's really interesting about this chart, I think, is that probably you haven't seen it before, right? Even though this is straight at IMF data, I would bet that most of you have never seen this before. And let me just pause and say that one part of the reason for that is because nobody wanted you to see it, right? There was a kind of conspiracy of the international financial institutions to suppress a lot of this information in ways similar to what happened when we were presenting it, which is that top economists would say, oh, this is ridiculous data. I can't believe you're showing this. It's official economic data from World Bank and IMF. But for all the economists who are leading economists, liberal economists, they're saying, no, this is complete nonsense. And actually, it doesn't really show anything, et cetera. And that's because the international financial institutions had a very strong interest in denying responsibility and also denying the existence of this depression, which they did pretty successfully because, as far as I can see, in Central and Eastern Europe, most people don't know about this, and a lot of people actually think the economy did really well during these years, as I mentioned before. So let me just show from, this is more specific, just broken down by country, The crazy country that goes off here is Bosnia, by the way. But you can see Ukraine is in GDP. I think this is GDP per capita. I can't actually see my own screen here. I think it's the same. Basically, this is the same chart, just broken down by country. And you can see that Ukraine is, at least in 2016, one of the worst performers economically during this period. Interestingly, Turkmenistan, which has a lot of oil, and Azerbaijan, recover a lot. Croatia, it's not just Ukraine, but also some EU member states like Croatia that are also not doing particularly well. Again, looking at triangulation, I don't want to belabor this particular chart, but a lot of people say, oh no, nothing really happened. So we look at other types of data. So in this chart, we look at the homicide data, and we also look at poverty data from the World Bank. And they both show that there was some very significant economic event that occurred around the same time, right? That there's a huge jump in poverty to almost 50% of the entire population of Central and East, the post-communist countries, is poor, peaking right around, I don't see the, peaking right around 2000. And also you can see that that's verified by the homicide rate, which also kind of peaks around the same time. So we use this data just to verify the economic data. And you can also see this at the individual level. I just want to say, if you look for photos, which I've often done when we were looking for a cover photo for our book, if you look for photos of economic reform or markets, Eastern Europe, then you'll find some pictures that are like this, which show a really prosperous, and by the way, these are both true. I'm not saying that these are inaccurate. These are, I think you'll see it is an accurate, real photo of looks like a Christmas market, right? Maybe in Czech Republic or Poland, I'm not sure. Where people are looking prosperous, they're dressed in kind of like, nice clothes and out enjoying themselves. This looks like Czech Republic. But you also find pictures like this, which is sort of pictures, I would imagine, of sort of rural poverty, right? And so there's also, in terms of our imaginations, in terms of the images that we see of transition, there is this kind of bifurcation. And also I meant to say that this type of bifurcation can be seen very much at the individual level. So again, there are people who did really well throughout this period and people who did really badly, not only countries, etc. What we do in the book then is we analyze, we used a lot of data to try to analyze the depth and duration of the collapse, looking at average indicators. And what I'm going to show you is a bunch of charts right now, or maps. We used average indicators to produce country rankings. So the best performing country and the worst performing country on whatever variable. The charts indicate the top, we group them into the top 10, the bottom 10, and then the median, just to visualize the impact. And we're only showing here the quantitative data here, the economic and demographic data, although we have a lot of other data. As I mentioned, some of the public opinion data I'll show you as well. I don't really have a good way of visualizing the anthropological data, but I can talk about it. So here's what we found. We look at the economy, and just look at Ukraine for a second, or you can look at Ukraine and look at Poland, right? Maybe the first time through it, we'll look at Ukraine. This is the economy, basically GDP per capita. During this period, Ukraine was one of the worst performers on GDP per capita. We also looked at death rates. Death rates really spiked. I'll show you that in a second, I think. Ukraine also was hit by a big spike in death rates, which I think was largely connected with alcoholism. Migration rate, actually, Ukraine didn't do so terrible. It was kind of average. The countries in the Balkans tended to do worse, and Central Asia. Life expectancy declines. Ukraine was among the most hard hit. Human Development Index, not a high performer. In terms of overall population, that's population growth. As you probably know, Ukraine did not well. And sorry, now I'm not seeing, this is, oh yeah, this is population growth, I believe. I can't see the label for some reason to my own slide, but I believe this is the chart on population growth. And if you look at Ukraine here, it's actually not atypical of former communist countries, but it, as you know, up until 2017 or 2018 rather, it looks like Ukraine lost more than 10% of its population, approximately 12% of the population. And that's, of course, before the wars. That was not, you know, that doesn't speak to like a really high economic performance, I don't think. This is a chart of, can somebody read me the label for the chart?
Life expectancy.
Oh, for life expectancy, right. So life expectancy, this is a really interesting one because it shows that the best performing countries, in this case, we just choose one best performing country. They had a very slight dip in life expectancy between 90 and 92, and then began to grow dramatically. And so you could argue that for Albania or for Bosnia, that, you know, increases in life expectancy are first of all typical throughout the developed world. And these are very strong developments in life expectancy. You can argue from looking at this that, okay, maybe there was some sort of economic recession, but it wasn't that deep and people's lives are better. In Ukraine, it would be much harder, and other countries and similar, so it would be harder to make that case because you had a decline in life expectancy by 1996 of the worst year was of 5 years, which is catastrophic. That's similar to a kind of decline that would happen during wartime, that happened during the 1990s. And Ukraine took much, much, much longer than these other countries to get back to the life expectancy they had in 1989. So today, of course, it is doing better, but it has lost a lot of ground during that time. And hasn't caught up with the other countries. And this again shows the inequality that I'm talking about. And, you know, this is true on a national level, but it's also true, I think one has to continue looking at this at an individual level, right? So there are individuals in Ukraine or any other country that are doing amazing and whose life expectancy is improving, and also individuals who are suffering this kind of collapse. So then you come to sort of, you know, we also look at what people think about these things. And this data just comes from Pew surveys. It was one of the few US pollsters. Actually, interestingly, another thing we found in the book is there's very few polls, public opinion surveys being done throughout the former communist world at all on any issue that's comparable, okay? So we're collecting tons of economic data, we're collecting demographic data, but during the entire transition period, nobody thinks to ask people, how do you think things are going, right? There's no agency that's asking these questions systematically year by year. In fact, Eurobarometer sort of does that a little bit, but only in the countries that joined the EU. For the most part, the international organizations weren't that interested in finding out what people thought about the transition because they thought that these were subjective indicators that didn't really mean very much. But the EBRD actually did do this life in transition survey starting in, I think, 2006. And they did that because of data like this, because they realized that even though they thought by their indicators that things were going really well in the transition countries, people weren't very satisfied with that. And you saw the little bit of that in the comments, right? When I asked, how did things go in the 1990s? Very few people said, it was amazing, right? A lot of people said there was a lot of corruption, there were oligarchs, there was a mafia, there was, you know, all the things that you said. And that's indicative of the fact that, you know, even until 2019, Ukraine didn't have strong support for market reforms, right? When you ask people how things are going, right? I forget, I can't again read this thing because of the way my thing's set up, but this is basically a question like, are you satisfied with market the market economy in your country. Of course, in Poland, you can see there's a dip to support, between 91, people are excited. 2009, people are a little more skeptical. But then by 2019, the economy is doing great. People are, naturally saying, yeah, we're satisfied with the market economy. East Germany, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Lithuania. But this survey, like a lot of surveys, is primarily conducted in those countries where things are going well. They didn't ask people in Turkmenistan or Kyrgyzstan, right? But they do ask people in Bulgaria, Ukraine, and Russia, and maybe not surprisingly, people are not that thrilled. In Bulgaria, there was a lot of enthusiasm for reform in 91. It's dissipated, still a majority, but dissipated by 2019. In Ukraine, because of the deep recession, in my opinion, even by 2019, people's opinion had not returned to, oh yeah, we're satisfied with this. This was not a satisfactory experience for a lot of people. And you can see that this is just one of the many polls we analyzed, but you can see that across particularly, I think I have here in the next slide, if I'm not mistaken, I'll show you something I think I put at the end, but this shows, this slide shows for, this is starting using the life and transition surveys. It shows a dramatic decline in public trust. Do you trust other people? That declines in Ukraine from, maybe 60 to maybe, I don't know, like 30%, during this time period. So, so I don't want to take up too much time with talking. I just want to, tell you that if I were to stand back and say, well, what were the problems in the 1990s? What was the reasons that these reforms didn't do that well as expected? And again, I'm not saying the reforms were uniformly a disaster. What I'm saying is that they were great for some proportion of the population that I would estimate around 30%, and they were bad for the majority of the population. This narrow focus on markets as a solution really led to dramatic increases in inequalities. There was an inattention to other aspects of institutional change. And, I think it shows that markets, while important, have to be embedded in some other types of social institutions that were not carefully thought about in the 1990s. I believe also, and this is based on some research, that there were some very big mistakes that were made. Somebody had mentioned mass privatization, but I think mass privatization probably was one of the huge mistakes that was made in the 1990s, meaning the coupon or free distribution of goods through coupons that really led to a rise of oligarchs and ownership concentration, and also poor corporate governance. I know you focus on good governance, and there's also good governance in the corporate world. So that appears to be, in my view, like that's an outcome of literature, and there's some interesting papers about that. And I think then finally, there's a sort of issue of methodological nationalism that the economic reformers tended to view these countries as individual countries that had specific political economy issues nationally, but tended to ignore the importance of the international dimension. And current research is showing that really the biggest indicator whether your economy did well or not is if you joined the EU. The European Union was a huge engine of growth, in part because it did other things than economic reform. So if we look at these lessons, I guess I want to say that I'm skeptical whether anyone's learned the lessons of the 1990s, right? I would say sort of yes and no, people learned lessons of the 1990s. When I read the international financial institutions programs for Ukraine, I feel a little discomfort. It seems to me that these institutions still maintain a strong belief in all the aspects of the market program, and are still unwilling to recognize all the problems that arose. In part, I attribute this to the fact that they would be illegitimate if they said, oh yeah, we made a mistake in the 1990s and it led to the worst recession in modern history. Can you imagine if the IMF came out and said, oh yeah, the advice we gave caused the worst recession in modern history, right? How seriously would people take the IMF after that? but yet that is the case. And then the other, what they say, by the way, in response to that, if I say, oh, you created the worst recession in modern history, they would say, well, actually, it wasn't our advice. It was the fact that countries didn't follow our advice, right? So Ukraine obviously did not follow the advice of the IMF well enough, and had it followed the advice of the IMF, it would have done amazingly. I consider that to be a false argument. You know, it's kind of like saying, look, I'm going to teach you how to fix your car, and, you know, there's going to be a 20% success rate. Like, some people are going to, you know, fix the car and it's going to drive and that's awesome. Other people, the car is going to be lying in the driveway disassembled. It's not my fault. It's just you didn't follow the instructions well enough, right? You know, that's kind of the argument they're making, in my view. What I see is that other priorities, where I see progress is when I look actually at the program for the Ukrainian government program for reconstruction. I see that, or the EU program, I see that, and in fact, all the international programs, you see that while there's a strong defense of what happened in the 1990s, other priorities are rising in importance in these programs. So in particular, you see security being talked about as a first order necessity, when probably security was always like an important issue that was neglected. And also there's an appreciation for the fact that the EU has to play a leading role in this, and that EU integration was actually more effective than the market reform programs, although they obviously went hand in hand to some degree. The EU, however, had a variety of other things that it was advancing: democracy, administrative competence, judicial reform, things like that, that hadn't been considered as strongly by the IMF or World Bank. And then I think the Ukrainian government program, when you look at it, it focuses on other areas, with markets as one component, but really pretty small, pretty much smaller component, right? Where it focuses heavily on security, on governmental and international investment. And it is pro-private sector and pro-market, but only as like sort of one component of this broader plan. So I do see some lessons being learned. I'm just going to show you like just look at the way, this is just from the Ukrainian government report, you know, just one page, one slide from its report talking about, we want to start up now, ramp up gradually. Like, compare that to shock therapy, right? We're going to ramp up gradually. Well, that sort of implies a sort of lesson that was learned from shock therapy, right? That you don't have to shock the economy to do this, to get a good result. We want to grow prosperity in an equitable way. Wow. You know, that's a pretty big, I don't think anyone, I ever heard that in the 1990s. The whole point was to increase inequality so that it would create motivation for people to perform economically better. Integrate into the EU, that was never part of any of the startup programs in the 1990s, in part because the EU didn't want to expand at that time and wasn't interested in expanding. And so countries had to kind of reach some bar without a strong, you know, promise. We want to build back better for the future. So we still have these principles of green transition and digital transformation. Those are very big projects, big governmental projects that are not market oriented. They're about government incentives and about principles and about, you know, really industrial policies towards figuring out the industries of the future. And then finally, they have enabled private investment and entrepreneurship. If this was produced in the 1990s, you would sort of eliminate the top four ideas and just focus on the fifth, and that would be pretty much what the economic programs in the 1990s looked like. So the way I read this is that the international organizations are not walking away from their ideas and their approaches in the 1990s, but now they're embedding it. It's become a much lower priority, and now they're embedding it in a bunch of other priorities, which are more important. And I think that is actually a good way to draw lessons from what happened in the 1990s. So with that, I'm going to end, and I really look forward to the discussion and any questions that you have. about any aspect of this. I'll just, so please ask some questions. I'll also monitor the chat and then come back and try to answer some questions. Thank you.
Yeah, friends, I encourage you to put your questions, but we have already some questions in our chat. We can pick up from there. For example, what would you think about social politics in Ukraine? What would you describe real situation in Ukraine connecting with financial troubles? I mean, like social politics, meaning like social services or what? Could you please?
Yeah. I can definitely talk about that. I mean, actually, a large part of my work has been on social protection, and I wrote a book about pension privatization worldwide, in which I did look at Ukraine to some degree. There's an interesting question about the shadow economy, the military economic situation, privatization, non-transparency, social politics. I guess I would say, I mean, first of all, I have to claim some ignorance here. I think that, in my opinion, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, Ukraine actually did all along try to devote significant state resources to providing pensions and other social protections to people during the depths of the recession. Okay. As much as a third of government spending was in this area, I believe a lot of it was highly redistributive, and the IMF always opposed it. So the IMF frequently came to Ukraine and said, you're spending too much on social protection. You've got to cut social protection because you've got to balance your budget. And I actually forgot to mention that I sometimes was an advisor to the World Bank and to USAID during this time period. And I had considerable access as a result to World Bank officials in Ukraine as well as other places. And I was always mystified why they thought this in a very poor country in the worst economic shape ever, why they thought that it was important to cut social protection. In fact, as far as I understand, Ukrainian governments never really cut it as much as the IMF wanted. But the issue was that even with the kind of redistributive social protection that did exist, people didn't do very well, right? Because the government revenues were limited. Somebody mentioned the shadow economy. Most of the economy was probably untaxed. The official sector of the economy was highly redistributive, but it just was insufficient to meet the needs of a population that was going through the worst economic recession in modern history. So I guess the answer is that that Ukraine has a pretty substantial social safety net. I haven't followed it in the past several years, but I assume that it is more generous today, and it does a little bit better. And I don't think that cutting it should have been a major priority. There were other priorities that should have been enacted, like, for instance, taxing the real economy, reining in oligarchs, etc. So that would be sort of a better approach, in my view, I guess. But I would be interested, if you have more specific questions, I'd be interested to discuss those.
We have several hands raised, and I want to let people ask you.
Maybe let people ask a series of questions, and then I will
so please,
respond.
Anna Fesik, you are welcomed to raise a question.
Dear Professor, thank you for your brilliant presentation. My name is Anna Fesik, joining from Canada. Your phrase regarding international community denied its responsibility for 1990s recession caught my attention. Could you please expand it? And any thoughts about application to Ukrainian post-war reconstruction these days?
Well, I guess I'd say that we in the book, we have a pretty long section on the EBRD in particular, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We have a pretty long analysis of their reports where they basically they cherry pick, this is a phrase in English, you just pick the cherries. You basically, find the best evidence, and then try to assemble that in some sort of narrative that explains, well, things are actually going really well. We have this indicator, it's really going great, and just ignore the other indicators. I think that's the type of thing that they're doing, is they're trying to construct narratives where they're not responsible and where everything's going better than is possible. And in fact, throughout the transition period, like when we started giving this talk in Eastern Europe, people, we didn't know what to expect. We thought, okay, some people will be upset, some people will be happy. But actually, one of the reactions we started getting was these very emotional reactions that we'd actually never had from an academic talk before, where people said, oh, you just explained, you just verified like my feelings or the experience of my family, right? Where, I did okay, but my dad really suffered during the transition or something like that, And so, so I think that what was happening is that so many people have been told that the transition was good and was positive and led to all these positive things, and told that if anybody wasn't experiencing that it was their fault and they were wrong and they had done something wrong. People have internalized that, I think, a lot in Central and Eastern Europe, and the international financial institutions are intending to do that very clearly. So, I again had, on a slightly different issue, but I had a debate with Jeffrey Sachs on email recently, actually about the war. As you may know, Jeffrey Sachs is not a supporter of Ukraine, really. So I was debating on that, but also talking about the economic reforms. And, to this day, even though he doesn't believe that Russia's economic reforms were very good, he defends his own advice there, and he blames the poor quality of the reforms on Russian policymakers, which I'm sure is partly true. But it's just the way that the transition narrative has been sold is that there's brief suffering and everything's going to be great, and so you should be happy. And if you're not happy, well, there's something wrong with you. I think that's the nature of the thing. So maybe go on to the next question.
Okay, please, Lana Oseletova, it's your turn.
Okay, Mітчелл, thank you for your lecture and presentation. So I have a question. What are the potential ways to address the economic challenges that arose from the reforms of the 1990s, and how might they impact Ukraine's contemporary development?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of impacts. I should say overall that, Ukraine today has recovered significantly, or rather before the war, Ukraine had recovered significantly and was doing okay. I don't think that right now one can talk about, Ukraine was doing better than it had been before. So a lot of the problems of the 1990s had been put behind Ukraine prior to the war. But it hadn't experienced like dramatic economic growth similar to Poland, etc. And I think a lot of the reasons that you all suggested were quite accurate. I think that and I'm just going to talk about the Reconstruction and Recovery Program is a very, very large government, initiative that reflects a kind of difference in economic philosophy that exists today, in which the state takes a lot bigger role in economic development than in the 1990s. In the 1990s, it was believed that the state should have no role or extremely limited role in the economy. And today it's believed that the government should have a very large role in the economy, should be coming up with big plans, like the one that Ukraine has come up with, that focus on indicative planning across a wide variety of areas, with government financing and international financing, seeding private financing, seeding, providing some role to private enterprise, but that development is much more of a government project than it is a private sector project. And I think that that is certainly correct in a situation of Reconstruction. And that Reconstruction probably is going to give Ukraine an opportunity to overcome some of the problems of the 1990s. What are the problems that particularly need to be overcome? Well, lack of faith in the government, which leads to lack of payment, of taxes. To some extent, it would be interesting to see if the government is able to rein in the oligarchs. I'm personally a little skeptical about that, but the attempt, I think, will be there to get the oligarchs to participate in programs that are dreamt up more by the government rather than the tail wagging the dog, as it were. So I guess I would hope that in this Reconstruction effort, it's a totally different philosophy, as I mentioned, you can see outlined here, which looks like to me like the government and international organizations have a much, much bigger role at setting priorities in lots of different sectors of the economy, and a lot more attention to not just the private sector, but to knowledge and information networks, to education, to housing. I mean, there was no attention, for instance, to housing at all during the 1990s. No attention to economic, really to what we would call industrial policy. Like, what's the strategy for the coal industry? What's the strategy for the defense industry? All those things are in this kind of Reconstruction program. I think that what we're looking at now is that there's been a shift in international perceptions about how to do economic development, in part because of the rise of China. During this time period, by the way, where Ukraine was suffering, China and Vietnam were prospering enormously, right? And so, although all my economist friends will say, oh, there's no comparison, but in fact, what's happening now is people are looking at the ways that those countries developed economically, with the centrality of the state in directing investment as well as private enterprise, or a different model of like state-private enterprise cooperation. And they're seeing that as a model, and that's part of what you see behind these guiding principles, is a global shift in the way people are thinking about economic development.
Okay, the next one is Bogdana Cherniak, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture and for this opportunity to ask you a question. I will start with some small story. Before, I was participating in a course, Держава Творць, it's like a creator state, last week, and a lot of our lecturers mentioned that, for example, Ukraine and Poland were in very similar situations after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but Poland could develop and Ukraine didn't use the chance. What do you think about the comparison of Ukrainian and Poland case in the economic sphere? And is it true that if Ukraine did some special things, we now would be like Poland? Thank you.
So it's again, that's a great question, and it responds to this, this kind of idea I put up before, that people are being told all the time that it was your fault, that you didn't do this right. And look, and I think so that narrative, like, had you been like Poland and just done everything we said, then you'd be great. There's a couple of false premises there. Okay, one is that the reason that Poland did so great is because it implemented all these economic reforms better than Ukraine. Well, that is just not true. Poland did better. Poland, it is true, to some extent, implemented more economic reforms than Ukraine, but Ukraine implemented a lot of the same reforms. The difference really was, first of all, geography, that Poland shares a border with Germany, right? And geography turns out to matter. In all the, Jeffrey Sachs, by the way, who I like as an interlocutor. We have different views, but I think he's an intelligent person. But he wrote a really interesting paper that showed that actually the level of economic reform in a country does not predict your GDP growth among the post-communist countries. that was believed, many people believe that and still believe it today. But actually the statistical evidence suggests that there was no difference between countries that had high degrees of economic reform and low degrees of economic reform. The biggest difference was geography and whether you joined the EU. Those are the two most important factors that determined the growth rate. And Poland had better geography than Ukraine, and was invited partly because of its geography to join the EU, whereas Ukraine wasn't. And now I think that what resonated with me is a number of, when we were talking before by the chat, that a number of people think there wasn't a much unity in Ukraine about the future of economic policy. Now, that I definitely think was an issue, right? Because Ukraine in the past was kind of poised in between the EU and Russia, right? Where a substantial proportion of the population in Ukraine wanted to have stronger relations with Russia, and a substantial proportion also wanted to have stronger relations with the West. And on average, the median voter, I think, in Ukraine at that point believed that they should kind of have both, that they should have close relations with Russia and close relations with the West. That's what public opinion polls suggest to me anyway. But of course, that shifted dramatically after the invasion in 2014 and of course in 2022. So now there's this really strong consensus to joining the West, which is similar to what Poland had and Czech had in the 1990s. And I think that is an important criteria for integrating into the European Union. The European Union wants countries in that are sure that they want to be in. And I don't think Ukraine was sure about that in the 1990s, but now there's this strong consensus. So, you know, because of its history, you know, Ukraine was in a very different place than Poland was in the 1990s, that's for sure. And I think that has changed dramatically.
Thank you so much. Daria Panova, please.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. Thank you for presenting your research. And to be honest, I was surprised by such a data that you collect, especially about Ukrainian so-called growth, opposite growth. So my question is more about future. How do you think does Ukraine, with its modern society, with some lessons that were learned from previous time, has a chance to achieve significant growth of economy, probably after the end of the war, maybe in some years? Because as for me, Ukrainian society is like waiting for his chance, and maybe they want to show how many power they have in how they want to change their country, their system, their even government toward the UN and its standards.
Yeah, I think that's really critically, what you've indicated is critically important, right? It does appear to me too right now that Ukrainian people, and this is where, when people ask also about the civil society versus the oligarchs, right? I think both are strengthened actually in this war, right? Or at the end of the war, we'll find that both are strengthened. And there had been this conflict between them and probably will continue, but it's important to note that civil society in Ukraine is extremely unified, very unified compared to other countries, right? And is hungry for the development, hungry for change. And that existence of that type of consensus did not exist, in my view, in the 1990s. I was around in the 1990s, so a lot of this is based on my personal experience. And I met many Ukrainians during the 1990s. And I think that even the ones who thought that they wanted to have a Western path for economy had a very unrealistic notion of what that would mean. It was a big difference from in Poland and Czech Republic at that time, where I spent a lot of time, or in Hungary. They were so close to the West that they understood exactly what was going on in those countries, right? They had always been able to get TV, or at least the elites could get TV signals and things. And they knew exactly what the West looked like and they knew that they wanted that. I think that things were kind of different, but I agree with you that it's extremely that having that strong societal consensus that you're talking about will bring success. That is one of the most important features, as well as part of it is this desire to integrate into the EU that the EU shares to some degree, right? The EU wants that also to happen, and it's going to be impossible for the EU to say no, I think, when there's this strong consensus like you're talking about. So I think that it could be a very exciting next 20 years for Ukraine. I think you're right to be optimistic about it.
Thank you.
And government plays a role of kind of channeling this, right? And that is also new. It's not the private sector, everything. It's about government channeling all this energy in a specific kind of direction, which is how I read the Ukrainian government plan.
Okay, prior to give the words to my colleague Ostap Yednak, I want to thank you to him, and due to him, this lecture is possible. So Ostap, thank you very much for organizing and for doing a great job for this lecture. Thank you so much, and please ask your question.
Yes, hello everybody. Dear Mitchell, thank you very much for agreeing to contribute to our students and to our initiative, and the lecture very much was very interesting. And I have one comment and one question. Regarding comment, it was a question about social policy and IMF, because at that time, in the beginning, between 2014 2018, I was in the parliament, and we had quite a lot of debates with IMF guys and with our Ministry of Finance. And basically, what I got feeling is that their requirement was rather to watch the debt and to be disciplined in terms of spending, not to increase all the time social spending and pension, etc. But the quality of our social benefits was extremely poor. I mean, at 2014, why we have cut a lot of social benefits was that we had like dozens, if not hundreds of them, to all kinds of groups of population, to veterans of Second World War, to Chernobyl disaster liquidators, even to people for free of charge bus services or railway stations, etc. But we also had a big lump of spending for energy subsidies, and a lot of our social benefits were also source of huge corruption and huge inefficiency in terms of administrating these social benefits. So basically, IMF was saying that, yes, we should watch our spendings on the social policy, but we should also optimize them. And we have cut a lot of them in terms of quantity. And there was also a lot of social injustice in such benefits when our judges, former members of parliament, etc., have been receiving huge money for their previous work because they basically appointed this spending. So we just need to do some cleaning in this, and we did some. But there was also a big temptation for every parliament to impose new social benefits to new groups, etc. So the government should be really disciplined in this respect. And regarding question, Mitchell, I have impression that we are going back to the 90s in terms of the huge devastation that the war is bringing to us, but also we are having more and more social state ownership and state administration in the economy. We have more than 70% of banking sector in the state ownership. We have more and more strategic enterprises in the state ownership because we seized Russian assets, etc. What would be your recommendation during post-war recovery? What mistakes should we avoid learning from the 90s? What we did wrong and what we should do right in terms of transformation and transition? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions, and thank you so much for, you know, working on them in your capacity in Parliament. I mean, very briefly, my view about the World Bank social policy is that, you know, yes, it is true that the World Bank comes into countries often saying we want to rationalize how these social benefits are made. But one has to look carefully what they mean by rationalization. Rationalization, a lot of times for the World Bank, means so-called targeting benefits. So they want to identify the people who actually need them and not give universal benefits that everybody gets. And I think that's a wrong approach. That was a devastating approach during the 1990s, because when you have 50% of your population that's poor, it doesn't really make sense to target benefits, actually, because what happened was with targeting is that a lot of people who should have been targeted actually didn't get benefits because of the simplicity of administration of universal benefits. So, you know, I guess that that yes, you know, some reforming the way they're done, and I'm sure there are more optimal ways to do them, but giving universal benefits is honestly a really, really effective method. It can be done rather simply, and I would look at the example of Poland's Family 500 Plus program, which is a very simple application process with a universal benefit that everybody gets, whether rich, poor, etc., as being a kind of model, as a model for that. So I think that the World Bank generally, you know, makes a decent point, but actually the way that they do these things is extremely problematic. And I'd love to have a longer conversation with you about that. But we do talk about that also in our book, some of the problems with the targeting, which is also vulnerable, by the way, to corruption. So then, in terms of privatization, I think you raise a good point, which is that the state may have too many enterprises, may not want to be in all the businesses that it's in. I think that the biggest problem in the 1990s turned out to be this coupon privatization or mass or voucher privatization. But as China and Vietnam have shown, you know, it's possible to privatize enterprises in some cases without giving up state control. But one should do it in a more intentional way by finding good buyers, right? So it's a perfectly legitimate thing to sell a bank to another bank, right? Or somebody who's a specialist in that area who can produce efficiency gains. But just generally give it to sort of an amorphous blob of coupon owners is turned out to be a bad choice that just strengthened oligarchs. And so the question in Ukraine would be, how do you not strengthen oligarchs in that process? Because presumably only the oligarchs are the ones who are going to have capital at the end of this war to purchase these state enterprises. So then there's a question of, do you want to have foreign ownership of these enterprises in many cases, or do you want to strengthen some one oligarch or another, or maintain state ownership? I'd point out that also state ownership is very strong in Norway. For instance, there's a lot of countries that have really highly functioning state enterprises. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund that owns 1.5% of all listed shares in the entire world. They have a number of Norsk Hydro, like a lot of great state enterprises there that operate on a principle of private management. So I don't think there's any one solution to that, but coming up with a good strategy for that is definitely part of this government program. And I guess the question is just, who does the Ukraine want to be the owners of these things, and who's going to be an efficient owner, and how much control do you want to cede to foreign enterprises as well?
We have the last hand raised by Sofia Zaladowska. Please ask your question.
Hi, everyone. I would connect by financial troubles. Thank you.
Okay.
So some of your question didn't come through. Could you repeat the question? Maybe just without video, just on voice.
Okay, what would you describe real situation in Ukraine connected by financial trouble?
I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm not in Ukraine, and I don't have a great understanding of exactly the situation, you know, domestically in terms of the economy. I would imagine from what I hear in the press that things are not, you know, terribly great, right? There's obviously a war going on, you know, it's limited economic performance. Many people have left the country. Economic activity is down. You know, on the other hand, there is a lot of money coming into the country, and there is an economy. I think you're in Kyiv, and I think the economy is fine in Kyiv, right? You know, to some extent, I think that people are you know, that I see that businesses are operating. I mean, you can tell me more about it, but I think that one of the challenges in Ukraine has always been, you know, that Kyiv and other big cities are not representative really of the whole country, you know, and so I had an opportunity to drive around a lot of smaller places in Ukraine back in 2017, and there are lots of small rural settlements that are disappearing or depopulating, right? So I think one would have to look at a wide variety of things, and I guess I'm just not really qualified to give you a really great, you know, up to date, you know, kind of look at what the economy is in Ukraine. You I'm sure know a lot better than I do that situation, but obviously judging from other wartime situations, you know, it's an imbalanced economy. So there's a lot of money going into war, and a lot of money going into the military, a lot of money going into weapons, right? So some sectors of the economy usually grow dramatically actually during a war, and other sectors are going to be, you know, in serious trouble.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. Sorry, we have about 3 minutes left, and I want to also to read the question from one gentleman, because we have very active ladies today. So in order to balance somehow the gender situation, Bogdana Sipenko asks, what do you think about equitable distribution of wealth? It sounds a little bit unreal. Even in highly developed countries, there is a wide distribution between prosperity levels. Is it even possible to reach a fair distribution of wealth? How it may look from your point of view?
So I've lived through probably life, you know, longer than you have, Bogdan, you know, and I remember when I was a child in the United States, the difference between CEO earnings and the average earnings of a factory worker were about 30 times, right? So if a factory worker was earning in the United States $20,000 per year, which might have been typical, the CEO was earning $600,000, right? 30 times. Today, that number is order of magnitude bigger. So today, the average CEO earns 400 times what the average worker earns in the United States, right? So if the average worker is earning $20,000, that means the average CEO is earning $8 million, right? So inequality under neoliberalism, under, you know, the policies of Reagan and Thatcher, everywhere in the world has grown. And they grew extremely dramatically in the former communist countries where incomes, as you know, were relatively compressed. So I remember a time when in Ukraine, the income of the top earners to the bottom earners was probably more like 5 or 10 to 1. Okay. And now you tell me what that is in Ukraine. I'm sure it is at least as great as it is in the United States, right? So don't think that differences in inequality are intractable, right? They change over time. They can change over time, and they have changed over time. And they've changed because of government policies, and because certain people control government policies, and because they put out this, you know, ideologies or belief systems that encourage us to think that that's all great, that's wonderful, and that's the way it should be, right? The question is that the way it should be, really? And that's the level that we operate in academia. We're sort of in the business of ideas, right? And so I guess we would be thinking about things, well, is that really functional, and for whom, that we have a 400 times difference between CEO earnings and average earnings, or not? And that's the question that I think people are asking and answering today, that inequality, most people in the US right now believe that inequality is out of hand. And I think that in a certain way, they believe that in Ukraine too, you know, in part because of sort of socialist traditions actually in Ukraine or other former communist countries. In general, people tend to believe more inequality than even they do in the United States. And if you look at this critique of the oligarchs, which people share generally, I think in Ukraine, that's really about inequality, right? It's like, why should these people have all the wealth, right? So I do think that that's a political discussion. It's an ideological discussion that's being had right now. And I think that that the consensus socially is kind of on the side of inequality is too great. Has that changed anything? No, I don't think it has yet. But I think that wars tend to change it. Piketty showed that wars, and Milanovic, that wars are big levelers of inequality because they destroy assets. So an average family may own an apartment. You can tell me how much an average apartment is in Ukraine. I'm going to say $20,000 an average apartment in Ukraine, or $10,000, right? 20,000. I don't know. You tell me what it is. But so an average family who lost their apartment lost $20,000. Akhmetov, who lost Azovstal, right? He lost billions of dollars, right? So what happens in wars is that when you destroy assets, it tends to create more equality, because the big asset owners lose more relatively to others. So one can expect that there's going to be a basis of higher equality. And plus, I think in the nature of this war in Ukraine, or the war Ukraine is fighting against this Russian invasion, that the fact is that Ukrainian people are a fundamental aspect of this, right? And people who have joined the army, they've laid their life down, they've fought, they've joined territorial defense, and it's very hard for the government to tell these people, oh, you don't deserve anything from this reform program, right? Those people presumably will be getting apartments and benefits, you know, from the government, and that will also lead to more equality. So I think it is reasonable, at least in Ukraine's case, to think that the war will produce a somewhat more equal outcome. But a lot of it depends on kind of how people think about that, and how the government thinks about that. And we can see here that the government does believe that they want prosperity to be grown in an equitable way. So I think that is possible. I think that they will possibly achieve it, although, you know, it's not like everybody's going to get the same, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Time flows so fast. So
yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, we have to finish our meeting. Professor Orenштайн, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation and brilliant lecture. So we are very impressed with all the material you collected and have presented. And I encourage everyone to visit the website mitchellorenstein.com and to get familiar with Professor and his books and everything. Thank you so much. And I hope all our people here, all our guests are satisfied and are impressed as well. Unfortunately, we have to finish our meeting, despite we have some questions in the chat, but probably we will fix them somehow, put out of the chat, and probably will manage somehow to probably answer later or so. But nevertheless, the first lecture within our project, Good Governance School, was very successful, and we are very grateful to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. I wish you success with this program. And if you'd ever like me to come back, I'm happy to do so. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. It's really a pleasure, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Yeah.